Today, we're going to be talking about the Elan School, a vital and horrifying centerpiece of the American troubled teen industry. If you feel this topic would be upsetting for you, please stop listening now. A pregnant teenage girl stands in the center of a ring of other teenagers, both boys and girls. Boxing gloves and headgear have been forcibly strapped onto her against her will. The other students are shouting at her, insulting her, degrading her. It's impossible to escape the ring. Her anxiety mounts, her heart races. She knows well what comes next. Other students, mostly well-built young boys, will take turns putting on boxing gloves and fighting her until she's beaten down. There is no other way out of the ring. Her pain, her suffering, at the hands of her fellow students is not only inevitable, it is encouraged. This is what therapy looked like in the Elan School. Indoctrinated teens beating other teens into indoctrination. This is what happened. Joe Ritchie was born in New York in 1945 into a troubled family. His father, Frank Ritchie, was a day laborer known locally as a drunk and prolific bar fighter. His widespread nickname was Bamboo, because he was known for bouncing back from taking hard impacts. By all accounts, he was a violent but charismatic man with a certain rough charm about him. And no doubt it was that charm he used to ensnare Joe's mother and Santoro. Both families, the Ritchies and the Santoros, were Italian-American immigrants, but they actively disliked each other. When Joe's parents divorced, he was sent to live with his maternal grandparents. His mother signed over her parental rights. The grandparents that raised him were poor and very religious. They regularly attended church mass. Joe himself was an altar boy as a youth and spent a lot of the time at a community center where he learned to box and play basketball. His friends considered Joe to be wild and tough, a charmer like his father Bamboo, but with a violent streak. You didn't want to cross Joe Ritchie. He was sharp, and even from a young age had a keen criminal instinct. He was drawn to crimes like stealing cars and other petty theft. Joe Ritchie, or Joey Rich to his friends, is not someone whose childhood is well documented. Because of his later fame and his talent for self-aggrandizement, it's difficult to tell which stories from his childhood are true, which are rumors spread by others, and which are things that Joe made up himself. I will share some of these stories with you in order to give context both for his troubled childhood and for the man he would become. But take these with a grain of salt. You must decide for yourself what you think is likely to be the truth in this instance. It is said that it was open knowledge that Joe was dating and was both romantically and physically involved with his social sciences teacher in junior high school. If this is true, it is, of course, statutory rape. Not to mention that it very likely further complicates Joe's psychology to do with older women and mother figures. There's no doubt already a tangled mess of problems thanks to his nuanced relationship with his mother. Joe would get in fights, steal cars, and do drugs. He reportedly regularly stole from his own neighbors, breaking into their homes to do so. At 15 years old, Joe stole a car and went joyriding with his friends. The crash was predictable. Being that it was the 1960s, Joe wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was flung from the vehicle at high speed. As a result of these reckless actions, Joe was hospitalized for months and needed to relearn how to walk. Joe's family and friends would later say that this was a negative turning point in Joe's life. Incredibly, it went downhill from here. While in the hospital, Joe was subjected to painkillers. This would become the catalyst for a heroin addiction that would run out of control and strain every relationship in Joe's life. One must remember, he was only 15 years old when the accident occurred. Within a year of getting out of the hospital, however, he was being bounced through treatment centers in New York City for both his drug addiction and his behavioral issues. He was sent first to a place called Persons in Need of Treatment, or PINS. He stayed there for 2 years before being allowed to return to high school in 1963. Little is said about what occurred to Joe at PINS, but given what comes later in his life, one must think that, for better or worse, it was incredibly influential on him. Eventually, he left school without having graduated at the age of 21 in 1966. He was forced to leave because he attempted to rob a mail truck. In court, he used the defense that he was robbing the vehicle in an attempt to make money to feed his heroin addiction. But his own friends contest this account. They say that Joe was over his addiction at this point. He was only using that as an excuse because he thought it would get him sent to a treatment center rather than prison, something that was incredibly popular as a form of rehabilitation at the time. So why did Joe really rob the truck? According to his friends, he just liked robbing things. If that was indeed the gambit that Joe had in mind, then it paid off. Rather than prison, he was sent to a place called Daytop Village. This treatment center had been inspired by a group called Synanon, a group that would later be exposed for both abuse and cult-like behaviors. But in this environment at Daytop, Joe Ritchie thrived. Daytop Village, in fact, is where Joe Ritchie learned about something that would later come to define and underscore many events in his own life, and would become a source of trauma for those who would later be under his care. It was called the game. The idea was simple. Addicts required extra accountability, more than regular people. And so the people in the care of Daytop Village would sit around in circles together, and your peers would point out your flaws, things you had done wrong, things you were not holding yourself accountable enough for in your day-to-day life. That was the idea. But in practice, what this really meant was screaming, bullying, getting in the faces of your fellow addicts and hurling insults at them while frothing at the mouth, cursing them, degrading and humiliating them, pointing out every single tiny flaw that they had and letting them know it was all their fault. Students at Daytop would gang up on each other to verbally and emotionally abuse one another in the name of therapy. And, of course, the better you were at breaking other people down, the more progress you were considered to be making on yourself. Joe Ritchie, a charismatic young man with a natural talent for manipulation, thrived under those conditions. He was one of the best there at breaking people, at directing other students on who to gang up on, finding their weaknesses, and sinking his teeth into it. This type of so-called therapy, which would later fittingly be dubbed attack therapy, has been widely discredited now. Psychologists have since observed that sociopaths are particularly good at this type of group therapy and at manipulating people in these environments to do what they want them to do. In fact, one study posited that it makes sociopaths worse. It teaches them that abusing others is a positive behavioral trait. Joe used his time at Daytop Village, under the guidance of the counselors there, to hone these skills to a razor's edge. But of course, that isn't how the staff at Daytop saw it. They viewed what he was doing as helping fellow patients get better. Joe received high praise for his skills in the game, and used his cunning and manipulation to work himself into better positions at Daytop. Soon, he was giving speeches and hosting speaking engagements for the facility and fundraising for them. He was their star. Undeniable in his charisma, he became the facility's top fundraiser in short order. Joe strongly believed in the game and preferred it to traditional therapy methods. To quote Joe, "I'd done therapy before, but this blew my mind." He was largely happy in his time at Daytop, but did not agree with all of their therapy methods. Some of their techniques, which were taken from their predecessor Synanon, included things like shaving your head as a punishment. Joe thought that was nonsense and often butted heads with administration over the various techniques employed. They told him that despite being their top fundraiser and qualified to give speeches to packed audiences about their techniques, he wasn't ready to graduate from the program. That's right, he was apparently not ready to graduate from the program he was the poster boy for. Or, perhaps, Daytop simply wasn't ready to lose their best fundraiser. Eventually, frustrated, Joe left the Daytop program. Shortly after, he met a woman named Sharon Terry. They shared some life experiences and how they grew up, with Sharon's parents having been alcoholics. Things moved quickly for them, and soon Joe was moving in with Sharon and her roommate, and shortly after that, they were engaged to be married. In proof that Joe had not given up on his life of hustling, after a minor car accident, he sued Sharon's insurance company and used the payout from that to buy her wedding ring. They married in December of 1969, when both of them were 24 years old. Now with a family to support, Joe needed a real job. But his only experiences in life were in two areas: crime and counseling. Lacking other options, he started to apply for jobs at the type of treatment centers that he himself had been in. It was becoming popular at the time in these facilities to take the approach of having both medical staff and former addicts to help treat new patients. They would work side by side to counsel people through their addictions. Joe landed a job at a place called Dartec. The founder of the Dartec program, Dr. Donald Pett, hired Joe Ritchie after a phone interview. He has said, "Joe had a very unusual way of getting many of the street people to follow him. He often got people to rally around him, kind of see things his way, do his bidding." Though this job wouldn't last, it was where he would meet Dr. Gerald Davidson, a Harvard-educated psychiatrist. Though their association was short, Joe left a big impression on Davidson, such that when he called Dr. Davidson a few years later, in 1971, with the notion of opening his own treatment facility, it didn't take much to bring Davidson on board as both an investor and a supposed medical advisor. These kinds of facilities, like Daytop Village, Dartec, Survival Inc., and Synanon, had gone through an explosion in popularity. By this time, it was incredibly popular and common for judges to remit addicted criminals into the care of treatment facilities, rather than sending them to prison. But like a great many things in the United States of America, the laws around these facilities varied greatly, state by state. At the time, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts all had very strict laws about the qualifications needed to work in these facilities. Just like a hospital, you needed medical credentials. Credentials that Joe did not have. The state of Maine, however, did not have these laws. And so, to Maine they went. At the beginning, the program was owned by Dr. Davidson and another man named David Goldberg, who helped with financing. The Ritchies used that money to rent a former summer camp in Naples, Maine, which they turned into their facility. Now, from the beginning, Dr. Davidson's role in all of this was largely just to put his name on the organization and the advertising, to make it look professional, to give the impression that there was a highly educated psychiatrist as part of the day-to-day operations. But this wasn't true. From the very start, it was always intended to be operated by Joe Ritchie, who had absolutely no medical credentials to speak of, and would also have no medical oversight from Davidson. This was always Ritchie's project. Dr. Davidson was merely lending his name and professional cachet to it. They could use it to claim their facility had a basis in clinical therapy. Dr. Davidson himself, however, never actually went to the facility that would become Elan School, and certainly had absolutely no hand in the programming therein. Davidson, in the end, was only involved to help them with their hustle, and so that they could say that the school had a basis in clinical therapy, when in truth, it was Ritchie and his wife Sharon that were making up all of the programs and rules. From the very beginning, Elan School was set up as a money-making scheme. the corrupt Dr. Davidson would use his psychiatric practice to refer patients of his own to the school that he was part owner of. He would also pay his colleagues, giving them kickbacks for every child that they successfully enrolled in Elan's program. Joe Ritchie himself used his connections from his time fundraising and a list of potentially wealthy patients from Dr. Davidson to go out and sell the school to people. He would visit families, touting Elan School as their only solution. Called it the Rolls-Royce of teen treatment centers. One of the great evils at the heart of what would come later was this greed. And how much did it cost to stay there? In 1971, it cost $1,200 per month per student. Adjusted for inflation, that represents about $9,500 per month now. Not only was it incredibly expensive, but obviously the longer a student stayed there, the more money Ritchie made. So his motivation was not to have students graduate, it was to have them stick around as long as possible. Joe Ritchie wanted to be wealthy, to be powerful. To quote from the unofficial biography of Joe Ritchie, Duck in a Raincoat by Maura Curley, "They never went out to eat or to the movies. Every activity centered around the therapeutic community and making lots of money. Sherry said her husband would often lay awake in bed thinking aloud about how they were going to make their first $100,000. Becoming rich was definitely an obsession that seemed to drive Joe," recalled an early staff member at Elan. Money was extremely important to him when he was earning $10K a year and driving an old Oldsmobile. It represented the power to be somebody important, who would be accepted by everybody around him, and that meant a lot. Elan School began to turn an incredible profit over time. They relocated to larger facilities several times before settling at a massive and permanent site in Poland, Maine. The Elan School at the time was receiving a huge amount of positive press, and any time that anything came up that would be investigated, the government of Maine helped to shut it down, since by this time, the school represented a significant portion of the state's economy. But what was actually going on inside of Elan School while it was being praised and glorified? The first program that Joe Ritchie innovated on was his own version of the game. He replaced this with what was called a general meeting. These meetings were not regularly scheduled, but rather would be called at unannounced times. The meetings were called against a specific person for just about any perceived wrong. It could be that you weren't working hard enough, that you had disobeyed a rule, that you had spoken to someone you were not supposed to speak to in the school's strict hierarchy. So what happened at a general meeting? One person was put in the corner, and every other student was encouraged to rush them, scream at them, hurl insults and curses and threats. Picture 150 red-faced, screaming, furious teenagers whose only emotional outlet inside the abuse factory that was Elan School was these general meetings. Imagine someone screaming every insult they can think of directly in your face at the top of their lungs, red-faced, fists clenched, their spit flicking your own face while they howl at you. They pick apart every single character flaw you have, every secret insecurity. And when they finish, it's time for the next person, and the next person, and the next person. This was very obviously nothing more than abuse. Bizarrely, Joe would publicly claim in interviews that the goal of this program was to instill self-reliance, self-respect, and a capacity for love. It's unclear how screaming at someone for hours every time they made a mistake was going to make them respect themselves. There were also the signs. The signs were often large pieces of poster board made by the students themselves that were worn around their necks like a sandwich board. They had to write whatever their mistake was on the sign. Whatever their fellow students had deemed wrong with their personality would be called out and worn literally around their neck day and night. Like the signs, there were also dunce caps, humiliating costumes, and physical labor punishments. You might have to, for instance, spend the entire day digging and then filling in holes. And then when you were done filling them in, you had to dig them and fill them in again. Worse still by far, there was solitary confinement. Students forced to sleep in a space the size of a broom closet and to do nothing but stare into the corner for months on end. Studies on prisoners that have undergone extreme lengths of solitary confinement have found that it is extremely detrimental to mental welfare, emotional welfare, and to social coping skills. Listening to this, you might note that many of these heinous punishments hinge on the students themselves punishing other students. What happened if they refused? If the students simply didn't participate in the system? That was part of the evil genius in the design. As you moved up in ranks in the hierarchy, you yourself were afforded more privileges and abused less. And so while some students initially resisted, eventually the sheer humiliation and terror of what they were going through found them participating, simply to alleviate their own situation. As months and years passed, many would eagerly participate in harming other students to make their own lives better. It became part of the cycle of abuse that they went through. This even included a kind of secret police force of students called expediters. Their job was to record the behavior of every other student at all times and report them for anything that they did wrong or that they needed punishing for. Some of the things you could be reported for include such outrageous behaviors as talking too loudly, talking too quietly, talking to someone you shouldn't be talking to, a low-ranked student talking to another low-ranking student, talking too much, not talking enough, looking at someone of the opposite sex, not looking at someone of the opposite sex, looking outside, looking at the floor, looking at the ceiling, reacting to insults, drawing, writing, or reading books without permission. In short, if the staff decided they wanted to punish you, they would find a reason to punish you. If all of this didn't already add up to an environment of extreme anxiety and emotional abuse, there were also physical punishments. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to create an exhaustive list of every abuse that was handed out by staff members at Elan. But I'd like to talk about a few of them. The first is spanking. There were spankings administered to students by groups of other students, with both bare hands and a ping-pong paddle. Often, this was as many as a dozen students taking turns spanking just one until the victim is bruised and bleeding. Some students report being unable to sit, having bruising from the backs of their knees up to their shoulders, and having thick scabbing and, later, scarring from the beatings they received. To quote again from Duck in a Raincoat, "She was paddled so violently with open hands and a wooden mallet that she had to be taken to the hospital. She went into shock and lost the ability to retain her bowel movements." Next, I'd like to talk about a punishment called the electric sauce. This was a term used to describe a mixture of garbage, ketchup, mustard, toothpaste, cigarette butts, old food, toilet water, and other refuse that would be poured over a person's head as a punishment. There are reports that this sauce even sometimes included human feces or bodily fluids. This was something the students themselves administered to each other, and the sauce was made up by the students as well. This punishment didn't seem to last more than a few years. Apparently, it was hard to justify any therapeutic value in it, even for a monster like Joe Ritchie. And finally, the most famous of the Elan School's horrific punishments: the ring. Joe Ritchie and Dr. Davidson would say that this punishment was only ever used against bullies, those who had been physically violent towards others or threatened to be. The idea behind it was that this would show them that violence was ultimately futile. There was always someone bigger than them, some larger threat, if they didn't learn to get along in society in more peaceful ways. This was untrue. The ring was used to punish nonviolent transgressions as well. When someone was sentenced to the ring, they would be surrounded by other students. Boxing gear would be put onto them by force, gloves, and sometimes, though not always, headgear. And then the students would fight each other. One-on-one battles between the sentenced student and another student. If they won, then another student would fight them, and another, in an endless line until ultimately the student being punished took a beating. To quote once more from Duck in a Raincoat, "Those used to defeat the person being punished were mostly large, well-built boys, fighting both male and female residents. 2 residents independently talked about a young female being forced into the ring. When she resisted, she was held down while residents tried to tie boxing gloves onto her hands. When that failed, she was sent into the ring barefisted and without headgear." Investigators also cited an incident where a pregnant girl was put in the ring and defeated. Evaluators observed that residents could be sent into the ring for any infraction, including not sharing in discussion groups. One student, a 15-year-old child named Phil Williams, even died in the ring in 1982. Williams was being punished for talking back to staff. Not violent behavior, as Ritchie said. He was beaten so badly that he died of a brain aneurysm. The state police would file no charges and, despite a dozen witnesses to what happened, would cite a lack of evidence as the reason. One would think that with students dying, constantly running away, and even reports of students attacking and sexually abusing other students, that the school would be investigated, shut down. You would be wrong. The state of Illinois eventually did send a team to investigate the school. They saw all of this, the ring, the spankings, the electric sauce, and issued a damning report. They pulled their wards of the state from the school. Because of this public report, the state of Maine, where the school was located, was forced to investigate as well. They gave the Elan School a warning that they would be coming, and so the school cleaned everything up before the investigators could arrive. Quote, "We lied through our teeth. What we couldn't cover up, we admitted to as the exception rather than the rule. The residents were thrilled when the place was overrun with investigators because they had a real fun time. We laid everybody off then, but everything the Illinois investigators said was true. Every last word of it." The conclusions from the investigators from Maine, however? There's no evidence of unjustifiable denials of civil liberties, or of mistreatment, brutality, or anything that could be considered abhorrent to all accepted standards of childcare. The residents of Elan interviewed usually expressed newfound feelings of dignity, self-assurance, and mental well-being. They attributed these feelings to the treatment they received at Elan. Further, they said, one of the cardinal rules of the Elan program is that the use of physical violence by either a staff member or a resident is strictly outlawed. This is despite Joe Ritchie publicly admitting to use of the ring and to the spankings. To compound this rather obvious cover-up, the state of Maine investigators went on to defend the use of the ring after having just said that it doesn't exist. To quote their report, "Only acts of repeated physical violence resulted in a person being placed in the ring, where rounds last about 1 minute and participants are evenly matched. Even if that were true, it would be horrible enough, but it wasn't. People were placed in the ring for all manner of imagined transgressions, and on top of that, no one in the world is evenly matched against 12 opponents in a row. Certainly a 13-year-old pregnant girl is not evenly matched against any 15-year-old boy. So which is it? That the cardinal rule of the program is that there's never to be any violence? Or that the violence is rare and participants evenly matched? It doesn't matter. We know both to be lies. In short, the investigators from Maine covered everything up to protect their economic interest in the school. They allowed the abuse of children to continue for many more years. Because of this report from Maine, Joe Ritchie was able to file a civil complaint against the state of Illinois, claiming that they had defamed the school and done $6.1 million in actual damages. They wanted an additional $4 million in punitive damages. Illinois filed a suit in response, saying that Elan employees had abused wards of the state. Eventually, it was settled out of court with no money changing hands except, of course, into the hands of lawyers on both sides. After the investigation, corrupt child abuse enabler Dr. Davidson had this to say. What happened was we got some conventional middle-aged mental health workers who saw certain things that they did not understand. The other thing was that the governor of Illinois at the time was a self-righteous guy who was trying to make political hay by bringing all the juveniles back to the state. They were disrupting things, asking kids, "Why do you obey?" The Illinois investigation, and subsequent dismissal of it by the Maine government, who had a vested economic interest in Elan, was, unbelievably, ultimately a positive thing for the school. Many people sided with the school and with the notion that their tough love approach was working, and was only upsetting to supposed weak-minded liberals. So more conservative states, with more conservative families, would end up sending a great number of students to Elan School. Joe Ritchie would later accurately tell the press that 3 of the students who were taken away by the state of Illinois would later flee back to Elan School. He would tout this as evidence that the school was helping them. In reality, it's far more likely that it's the same reason as people returning to abusive relationships, or indeed, the same reason that some former Elan students would go on to be staff members at the school, helping to perpetuate the violence. After long enough being abused, bullied, belittled, and forced to live in a strict environment, it is incredibly difficult to adjust and live outside of the abusive situation that had been set up for them. The same phenomenon can be observed in longtime prisoners who have trouble adjusting to the outside world. That raises the question of what did happen to the students that left Elan and graduated out of their program. The school itself would claim an 80% success rate, in that 80% of the graduates did not end up in further trouble with the law. Note first that this only accounts for full graduates, not those who attended for years but did not graduate. Further, these numbers that Elan touts were obtained by a simple questionnaire with former students. The answers were not independently checked. But 4 states did do independent investigations into the fate of Elan's students that had been from their own states, and those numbers tell a different story. They said that 17% of them were in jail, 17% were working or in school, and a staggering 42% were, in the words of one official, living marginal lives that include petty crime, frequent unemployment, and abuse of alcohol or drugs. In short, all of Elan's own data that they put forward about their 80% success rate, it was based on the prospect of abuse victims self-reporting their success to their abuser. I'm sure even a moment of thought will reveal to you why that might not be accurate. There are actually some individuals who claim the school did help them. Generally, these are cases where the individual reports that they were likely to have overdosed on drugs if they did not get sent to a residential treatment program. Even then, they will often cite that they are irrevocably changed and damaged from their time at the school, even if it saved them. On a broader statistical note, there is, naturally, no evidence that the Elan School helped anyone at a population level. Statistically, outcomes were either equal to or far worse than those who were not treated at the school. And I cannot stress this enough. While it is important to recognize the opinions of the survivors of Elan School, we do not ask victims of abuse if the abuse helped them. We do not ask victims of torture how they feel their life would have gone if they hadn't been tortured. There are many great reasons for this, not the least of which is the brainwashing and psychological damage that has been done to longtime residents of the school. More importantly, how someone feels about their abuser does not change whether or not an act of abuse has been committed. One teacher from the Elan School has been quoted as saying that putting labels of right or wrong and good or bad on what they did at the school would be unfair. Personally, I think beating children to death in a ring is wrong. I don't remotely feel that it's unfair to say so. In short, they are not sorry for what they did. Eventually, Rhode Island sent a team of investigators to Elan, who were horrified to find out that not only did the business lack a board of directors, it lacked any medical oversight mechanism at all to review therapeutic tactics or employee behavior. They talked to Dr. Davidson and were shocked to find out that he spent absolutely no time at the school and could not provide even basic answers about punishments like the ring. There were 3 psychologists on staff at Elan now, but all were very recent hires who, like Dr. Davidson, knew nothing about how the school functioned on a daily basis. Some students would claim that these psychologists were intentionally prevented from knowing anything about the school, and that all therapy sessions were done with another, higher power student present who would report you if you said anything about the abuse so that you could be punished. The Rhode Island investigators would find that 60% of former residents were later found to have been arrested for criminal violations. This is noted as likely to be a conservative estimate of failure rates at Elan, as criminal records did not reflect child abuse, neglect, mental health institutionalization, or a variety of other factors. By this point, with thousands of students being funneled through the Elan School, Joe Ritchie, Sharon, and Dr. Davidson had all become insanely wealthy. By 2011, when the school closed, the cost of 1 year's tuition at Elan School was just under $55,000. It was eventually the internet itself and the bravery of former students coming forward that closed Elan School. Internet communities like Reddit allowed these former students to find each other and to bring their stories forward together. This bad press, along with the death of Joe Ritchie, eventually led to his now ex-wife shutting Elan down. But there was no justice, no punishment. Everyone involved in this horrible tale got away with it. More than that, they profited from it. While Elan School is closed, the industry that it was part of has not gone anywhere. The troubled teen industry not only still exists, but camps, schools, retreats, and treatment centers are a $1 billion per year industry in the United States. And at the vast majority of these places, abuse runs rampant. Thank you for listening. This has been A Troubled Past. What are your thoughts on the troubled teen industry, or about Joe Ritchie, Sharon Terry, and Dr. Davidson and how they completely escaped punishment for, and in fact were enriched by, their horrible crimes? Let me know in the comments what you think justice would look like in this case, and if you think such treatment centers should still be allowed to exist. If you'd like to hear more stories, please follow us on social media. And let me know if there are other topics you'd like to hear me cover in this way.